Good day, Zafis. I hope this video finds you well. So normally I wouldn't choose to take aim at the Center for Risk Analysis because they tend to provide solid informative content on the country and things that affect the country. But I do have to call bullshit on this recent video of theirs where they're discussing immigration. Now just to give you context, Gebrand van Heerden is discussing in this video the South African view on immigration, the extent of xenophobia in the country, and the actual contribution of immigrants to the South African economy. The problem is that in making his case, he's just repeating and recycling talking points they were making in America as much as a decade ago, and that we've already heard 1,000 times in South Africa. Anyone halfway informed already knows what he's saying, and has already heard the rebuttals to it, which of course makes this whole video and this response too tempting to pass up. But before I get into Gebrand's discussion of immigration, I do want to speak quickly to the host's introduction and what I think might be a part of the underlying motivation for this video from the CRA.
Recently, there have been a number of attacks on trucks in protest to the employment of foreign nationals in the freight sector. This follows after local truck driver associations accused the sector of preferring to employ foreign nationals over South African citizens.
Okay, so let's get this one out of the way quickly. The attacks on our truckers, who, by the way, represent the overwhelming majority of domestic shipping and trade, are absolutely unforgivable assaults upon the nation and its people. I view such actions as being a national security risk, and anyone complaining about immigrants, while launching such a direct assault on the shared economic interests of South Africa, barely deserves to be called a South African. And if the CRA's motive is to dissuade such a response, then I support that underlying message. But at the same time, I don't think that they chose the most responsible approach to the topic. And ultimately, yes, if local shipping and freight companies do favor employing foreign nationals over South Africans, that is a situation that needs to be investigated and responsibly rectified.
Now, in 2013, research by the Human Science Research Council showed that about 2/3 of South Africans polled were in favor of closing the South African border to immigration. Many of these South Africans polled were also in favor of restrictive immigration policies, and they also strongly believe that immigrants in the country should not be granted the same rights as South African citizens.
So as is my habit, I went and I found this study that Gebrand is referring to, and I want to make two big points about it to provide some context that he's chosen to ignore. One, on the topic of closed borders, the question was so broad as to have almost made it pointless to ask. It lumps immigrants and refugees into one question, which means it is lumping three groups of people into one category: legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, and refugees. Each of these is a category unto itself, and each requires an individual discussion. Lumping them together simply removes the nuance from the conversation and causes frustration in anyone looking for a good faith debate. And the second point is that if you look at the statistics directly alongside the only ones that Gebrand cites, you'll see that a majority of South Africans also want us to aid other African countries, and a majority of South Africans want us to take a tougher approach to the political situation in Zimbabwe. That paints a very different picture to the one that would call us xenophobic. Consider for a moment how unreasonable it is to ask South Africans to blindly accept anyone who crosses our borders, while at the same time our government has been complicit, whether through action or inaction, in the destabilization of neighboring nations.
There was also a similar finding by a more recent study in 2020 by the Ichikubets Family Foundation. Now, in the report titled The African Youth Survey of 2020, they interviewed more than 4,000 young Africans across the continent. And what was found was that the majority of young people from most of the countries that participated in the survey were welcoming to immigrants. In fact, more than 80% of young people from Senegal and Rwanda agreed with the statement that their countries should help refugees from neighboring countries, regardless of their impact on the economy.
So I also looked this report up, but to be honest, it was a pretty shitty report in its presentation. It was incomplete, stuffed with fluff, and very selective in its presentation of information. so I couldn't really review a comparison of the statistics, but it does list Rwanda, Senegal, and Mali as being the most welcoming African nations to immigrants. I provided a link in the description if you want to go and give it a look, but the point I want to make here doesn't really rely on it. Look, of those three examples, Senegal and Mali are both countries from which refugees are actively seeking asylum. Mali in particular is in the midst of a terrorist crisis that's driving people out of the country, so that's kind of a point worth mentioning when making this comparison. It's also worth mentioning that South Africa is already home to far more foreign refugees than both of those countries combined, however welcoming their citizens may feel that they are. And then, given Rwanda's recent and semi-recent history, their welcoming attitude may have something to do with historical guilt and maybe the need for population replacement. That's sheer speculation on my part, but it's at least fair to say that our circumstances and historical contexts are so wildly different as to make comparison meaningless.
So when we look at more than 1,000 foreign-owned businesses in Johannesburg and Cape Town, what the IRR found was that a third of the employees working for those foreign-owned businesses were South African.
Okay, so first off, I could be way off the mark here, but it seems to me that a business operating in South Africa should maybe be expected to have a greater proportion of South African employees than just 1/3. I mean, this whole video starts with the statement that South Africans are complaining about companies preferring to hire foreigners, and this basically says that yes, that's true. And then over and above that, I read through the IRR report that Gebrand is referencing here, and I've got to say that it raises some moral eyebrows. It is again blurry on the details and doesn't always distinguish between legal and illegal immigrants, and when it does, it essentially paints poorer immigrants as being beneficial for the country simply because they are an importable and exploitable underclass. They do not have access to the protections offered to South Africans, and so they can be paid a subhuman wage and be forced to rent rooms that offer subhuman living conditions. And since their countries of origin are often in turmoil, with many fleeing for greener pastures, a lot of immigrants come with extended networks of families and friends who can be similarly exploited. The argument being that if South Africans want to compete, we have to be willing to be exploited in much the same way as desperate people fleeing war zones. Now, anecdotally, I've seen this myself, as I'm sure of many of you. I used to work at a small advertising agency of about 20 people, and about a third to half of them were Zimbabwean. The rationale behind that hiring was not hard to understand. Until fairly recently, the Zimbabwean education system, inherited from the British, was world class, and the Zimbabwean people are desperate. This means that an employer can get a well-spoken, hard-working, skilled, and educated Zimbabwean at a discount that falls well below the market rates a South African might expect for the same work. And I'll even admit that white South Africans are often prima donnas who sometimes behave as though we think we're royalty, of whom only certain tasks can be expected. And black South Africans are often plagued by the sense of entitlement that comes from having commies tell you for 27 years that the world owes you something. Immigrants, especially desperate immigrants coming in from countries that have fallen apart, don't have these hang-ups. They tend to have a solid work ethic motivated by a sense of urgency that comes from having seen just how bad things can get when your country collapses. So it does have to be acknowledged that South Africans are often the best reason to hire non-South Africans. But it also has to be acknowledged that this is maybe not the best or most forward-thinking approach to the question of immigration, especially the immigration of low and no-skilled workers. In this report, the IRR focuses on the economic aspects of immigration, and then it somewhat blurs the lines between legal immigrants, illegal immigrants, and refugee, apparently so that it can skirt the fact that historically, low-skilled immigration is almost always detrimental to the native poor, and it is predominantly poor South Africans who most vocally complain about immigration. Also, issues of culture and national sovereignty and security should come into focus almost as much as economic concerns. By omitting these, this discussion ignores the fact that the terrorist concern in South Africa is growing. The SADC has allowed the conflict in Mozambique to heat up to the point that it represents a legitimate terrorist threat to our country. Ignoring issues like that is why Britain left the EU and why talk of civil war has been picking up in France, so maybe we should be paying more attention to these things. Look, as an English-speaking white man in Africa, I'd be an idiot to claim that I am completely anti-immigration. And I in no way support brutality being committed against our African neighbors. Whether he drives a truck or owns a spaza shop, the law-abiding immigrant in South Africa should not fear for his employment or for his personal safety. We should all be better than that barbarism. But at the same time, South Africa is in many ways still a divided nation, struggling to develop a unified national identity and also struggling to give our own people a purpose. We do have an unemployment crisis, as well as one of the highest crime rates in the world. We also have active globalist organizations and ideologies working toward a pan-African goal against which South African nationalist sentiment can actually act as a healthy counterbalance. We have a minimum wage that prices locals out of the legitimate job market and bolsters an informal sector that both exploits and is exploited by illegal immigrants. We have race-based employment policies and labor laws that disincentivize hard work and an education system that completely fails to prepare our people with the skills that South Africa needs. The question of immigration cannot be tackled with broad, sweeping statements that only reflect a very selective view of that reality, and we cannot treat the complaints of a majority of the population as though they can be ignored, deflected from, or stepped around. I can't say for sure whether or not immigration is a net benefit to South Africa, but I strongly suspect that the question leaves out too much nuance for its answer to be of much value at all to the people who most want to know. Anyway guys, that's my 10 cents on the issue. Please don't interpret this video as an attack on either the IRR or the CRA. Both organizations provide incredible content, do great work, and I'm usually a fan of both. Just in this case, I happen to disagree with them. If you've made it this far into the video, thank you very much. Please hit like, hit subscribe, and I will catch you later. Cheers.